Welcome to Life Story 999. In today's story, an unexpected encounter unfolds when Officer Tom Richards answers a routine call about a suspected burglary. Arriving at the home of Mr. Lee Turner, an elderly veteran, Tom soon realizes this isn't an ordinary call. What he discovers will test his compassion, sense of duty, and challenge his own beliefs. Don't forget to like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to Life Story 999 for more gripping stories. The night lay still over the small town of Holloway, its silence occasionally broken by the steady murmur of Officer Tom Richards and his partner, Sarah Gomez. The soft glow of their patrol car's dashboard illuminated their faces as they cruised down the quiet streets. Tom, a seasoned officer in his late 50s, had spent most of his career patrolling towns like this one. Now, with retirement looming closer, these peaceful night shifts were something he had grown to cherish, a last lap around a town he had grown to know so intimately. His partner, Sarah, a sharp-witted and competent officer in her 30s, often marveled at how much comfort Tom found in the predictable routine of their patrols. Another quiet night in Holloway, Sarah mused, her voice tinged with a mix of contentment and boredom. She glanced out the window at the deserted streets, the lamplights casting soft, golden glows that danced across their path. Tom smiled faintly, nodding in agreement. "Quiet's good," he replied. "It means everyone's safe. No one needs us to intervene." He settled deeper into his seat, watching the familiar storefronts pass by. A hardware store here, a bakery there. The streets were empty, with only the occasional flash of a stray cat or the rustle of a late-night wind through the branches. But the calm was suddenly shattered when their radio crackled to life, piercing the silence. "Dispatch to Unit 17. We have a 911 report of a suspected burglary at 2049 Hemlock Drive. Caller identifies as Lee Turner, 82-year-old black male, veteran." The easy calm in the car vanished instantly. Tom straightened in his seat, his hand already moving to flick on the patrol car's lights. Beside him, Sarah reached for the radio, her fingers moving swiftly over the buttons. "Copy that, dispatch," Sarah said, her voice adopting a professional steadiness. "Unit 17 responding. Estimated arrival in 5 minutes." Tom turned the wheel sharply, the tires crunching on the gravel as they switched direction. Hemlock Drive was on the outskirts of town, an area that had seen better days. The houses were older, many of them worn by years of neglect. Lee Turner. The name didn't ring a bell for Tom, though he had spent decades in this community. He had known many veterans, and he made a point of remembering them, but Mr. Turner's name didn't spark any recognition. "Do you know this guy?" Sarah asked, glancing at Tom as they sped towards the address. The siren's echo bounced off the nearby buildings, a hauntingly lonely sound on such an otherwise still night. Tom shook his head. "No, never heard of him," he admitted, his brow furrowing slightly. "But it's not unusual out here. Folks on the outskirts, they tend to keep to themselves." As they approached the edge of town, the houses grew sparse, separated by fields that once held crops but had since turned fallow. There was something about this call that unsettled Tom. Perhaps it was the mention of Mr. Turner's age or the isolated nature of his home. Burglary wasn't uncommon, but something about this one felt different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but years of experience had taught him to trust his instincts. "You feel it too, don't you?" Sarah said, her voice low as she peered into the darkness ahead, where the outline of Mr. Turner's home was just starting to come into view. A flickering porch light was the only sign of life, illuminating the house that seemed to sag beneath the weight of its age and wear. Tom nodded, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Yeah, something's off. He couldn't quite shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him since they'd received the call. The house at 2049 Hemlock Drive was a modest one-story structure, its once white siding now faded and chipped. A lone porch light flickered weakly, casting long shadows across an overgrown lawn. As they pulled up to the curb, Tom turned off the siren, letting the silence fall once more around them. The chill of the night seemed to seep in through the car windows, an unwelcome reminder of the isolation of this place. "Stay sharp," Tom said quietly, glancing at Sarah as they exited the patrol car. Sarah nodded, her eyes already scanning the area. She placed a reassuring hand on the handle of her flashlight, ready for whatever they might find. The air outside was crisp, their breaths forming small clouds as they approached the porch. The weak bulb above them buzzed faintly, struggling to maintain its glow. On the porch stood an elderly man, hunched and bundled up in thick layers, his frame swallowed by the oversized clothing. His face was creased with lines that spoke of many hard years, his eyes weary but alert. Beside him stood a large Labrador, its muzzle graying and its demeanor subdued. The dog's eyes watched the officers with a mixture of curiosity and protectiveness. "Mr. Turner?" Tom called out, his voice gentle. He could see the weariness in the old man's eyes, and he didn't want to add any more fear to whatever was already happening. The man nodded, his gaze shifting from Tom to Sarah, then back again. "Officer Richards? I appreciate you coming," he said, his voice rough, as though unused to much conversation. "Of course, sir. We're here to help," Tom replied. "Why don't you tell us what happened?" Mr. Turner gestured towards the side of the house, his hand trembling slightly. "Heard a noise out back," he said. "Sounded like glass breaking. I went and checked. Saw the window was busted. Buddy here started barking, and I reckon whoever got scared off." Tom exchanged a glance with Sarah. She nodded slightly, already moving to follow Mr. Turner's gesture towards the back of the house. "All right, Mr. Turner. We'll take a look," Tom assured him. "Just stay here for now. Keep Buddy close. We'll see if we can figure out what's going on." As they made their way around the side of the house, Tom couldn't shake the feeling that had settled deep in his gut. This was more than just a routine break-in. He could feel it in the cold, still air. Whatever was waiting for them beyond the corner of that old house, he knew it was going to change things for all of them. Tom and Sarah arrived at the old house, the wheels of their patrol car crunching against the gravel as they came to a stop. In the dim glow of the flickering porch light, they saw Mr. Turner standing with his loyal dog, Max, by his side. Max was a large Labrador, his muzzle gray from age, his eyes weary but watchful. The house seemed almost a hunch under the weight of its own age, and the thin layer of snow covering the overgrown lawn gave the scene a ghostly, sad atmosphere. "Evening, Mr. Turner," Tom called out as they approached, his voice calm and reassuring. He could see the worry in the old man's eyes, the lines of age deepened by concern. "We're here to help. Why don't you tell us what happened?" Mr. Turner nodded slowly, gesturing towards the back of the house. His hand trembled slightly, a sign of both his age and the anxiety of the situation. "Heard some noises out back," he said, his voice raspy, like it hadn't been used much in recent times. "Sounded like glass breaking. I went to check and found the window back there busted. Max started barking, and I reckon whoever got scared off." Tom exchanged a look with Sarah. There was something deeply unsettling about the whole scene. The isolated house, the broken window, and the frail figure of Mr. Turner standing out in the cold all seemed to suggest that this was more than just a simple burglary. There was a feeling in the air, a heaviness that neither officer could shake. "We'll take a look, Mr. Turner," Sarah said, offering a gentle smile. "You just stay here with Max, okay? We'll make sure everything is all right." Mr. Turner nodded again, his eyes shifting to his dog, who stood faithfully by his side. Tom couldn't help but notice the bond between the old man and his dog. The way Max seemed to understand his owner's need for reassurance, his body positioned protectively beside Mr. Turner, even as his tail gave a slow, half-hearted wag at the officer's presence. Tom and Sarah moved around the side of the house, their boots crunching softly in the thin layer of snow. The night air was crisp, their breaths forming small clouds as they walked. The beam from Tom's flashlight swept across the back of the house, illuminating the broken window that Mr. Turner had described. Glass shards were scattered on the snow, glinting like jagged stars in the darkness. "Looks like it was broken from the outside," Tom said, crouching down to get a closer look. He frowned, examining the break pattern. It didn't look random. It seemed deliberate, like someone had been trying to find a way in. He glanced at Sarah, who was scanning the yard with her own flashlight. "Footprints," Sarah called out, her light catching a faint trail leading away from the window towards a tree line at the edge of the property. The prints were partially filled with snow, suggesting they weren't fresh, but recent enough to still be visible. "Looks like whoever did this took off that way." Tom stood, his eyes following the direction of the footprints. The unease in his gut deepened. Something about this didn't feel right. Why target an elderly man living alone in an isolated house? There were no signs of valuables, nothing that would make this home an attractive target for a burglar. He glanced back towards the front of the house, where Mr. Turner stood with Max, the old man's silhouette barely visible in the weak porch light. "This isn't just a random break-in," Tom said, his voice low so only Sarah could hear. "Feels like there's something more going on here." Sarah nodded, her expression mirroring his concern. "You think he might be targeted?" she asked, her eyes meeting Tom's. It was a possibility neither of them wanted to consider, but one that seemed more likely with every passing moment. Tom sighed, the cold air stinging his lungs. "Could be. We need to get more information from him. See if there's anyone who might have a reason to want to scare him." They made their way back to the front of the house, their footsteps careful and measured. Mr. Turner looked up as they approached, his face lined with worry. Max gave a soft bark, his tail wagging slightly as Tom crouched down to scratch behind his ears. "Mr. Turner," Tom began, standing again to meet the old man's gaze. "We found some footprints leading away from the window towards the woods. We're going to need to ask you a few questions. Is there anyone you can think of who might want to do this? Anyone who's been giving you trouble lately?" Mr. Turner frowned, his brow furrowing deeply. He seemed to think for a long moment, his eyes clouding with uncertainty. "No one comes to mind," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep to myself mostly. Don't bother nobody, and they don't bother me." Tom nodded, though the answer did little to ease his concern. "We're going to make sure you're safe, Mr. Turner. But if you think of anything, even something that might not seem important, you let us know, all right?" The old man nodded, his eyes misting over slightly. "I appreciate it, officers. I really do. It's just been me and Max out here for a long time. We don't get much company." Tom felt a pang of sympathy. There was a loneliness in Mr. Turner's voice that went beyond the current situation. It was the kind of loneliness that came from years of isolation, of being forgotten by the world around you. He exchanged a glance with Sarah, who gave him a slight nod. "We'll do everything we can to help," Tom said, his voice firm. He reached out, giving Mr. Turner's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Why don't you head inside, get warm? We'll stick around for a bit. Make sure everything's clear." Mr. Turner hesitated, then nodded, turning slowly to head back towards the front door. Max followed closely at his heels, his head turning to give one last glance at the officers before disappearing inside. As the door closed behind them, Tom turned to Sarah, his expression serious. "We need to keep an eye on this place. Something's not right, and until we figure out what it is, I'm not comfortable leaving him out here alone." Sarah nodded in agreement, her eyes scanning the darkened tree line once more. "We'll get to the bottom of it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Whatever's going on, we'll make sure Mr. Turner is safe." Upon stepping inside the house, Tom and Sarah were immediately struck by the sight of Mr. Turner's worn-out living conditions. The air was cold, and despite the clutter of old belongings, the space felt empty in a way that only time and neglect could create. The house was filled with relics of the past. Faded photographs, knickknacks that spoke of long-gone memories, and furniture that had seen better days. The only source of warmth came from a small, outdated gas heater in the corner, its flame flickering weakly as if it too was struggling to stay alive. Tom took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. There was no central heating, no signs of anything to combat the cold that had seeped into the very walls of the home. The frigid temperature made Tom's concern grow. It was one thing to deal with a broken window, but another entirely to realize that Mr. Turner was living in such unsafe conditions. The old veteran had clearly been making do with whatever he had, but it was apparent that it wasn't nearly enough. Sarah caught Tom's eye, and he could see the same concern reflected in her gaze. She stepped forward, her voice gentle. "Mr. Turner, is it always this cold in here?" she asked, looking over at the small heater that seemed barely adequate to heat even the smallest of rooms. Mr. Turner gave a tired shrug. His shoulders hunched as he settled into a worn armchair. "Gas heater does what it can," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He glanced at Max, who had taken his usual spot at his feet, curling into a tight ball to conserve warmth. "Max keeps me company, keeps me warm on the coldest nights. We get by." Tom's heart sank. It was one thing to hear about people struggling. It was another thing entirely to see it firsthand. The thought of an 82-year-old man relying on a small heater and a dog for warmth was almost too much to bear. He stepped closer, crouching down beside Mr. Turner, so he could look him in the eye. "Mr. Turner, I know you're doing your best, but this isn't safe," Tom said gently. "The temperature's too low, and that gas heater, it could be dangerous. We need to make sure you're properly taken care of, especially with winter getting worse." Mr. Turner looked away, his eyes drifting towards one of the faded photographs on a nearby shelf. It was a picture of a much younger version of himself, standing proudly in his military uniform. Next to him was a woman, her smile bright and full of life. The weight of the years seemed to press down on him as he spoke. "I've always managed on my own," he said quietly, his voice almost lost in the stillness of the room. "After Mary passed, it's just been me and Max. We don't need much." Sarah exchanged a glance with Tom. She could feel the pride in Mr. Turner's words, the fierce independence that had likely carried him through countless hardships. But it was also clear that he needed help, whether he wanted to admit it or not. She stepped forward, her tone softening further. "We understand, Mr. Turner. You've done so much on your own, but everyone needs a little help now and then. It doesn't mean you're not capable. It just means you deserve better than this." Mr. Turner remained silent, his gaze fixed on the photograph. Tom stood, his eyes scanning the rest of the room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with dusty trinkets and books whose spines were cracked and worn. There were medals too, symbols of a time when Mr. Turner had been strong, capable, a man of action. Now, those medals seemed to serve as reminders of what once was, relics of a life that had slowly faded away. Tom walked over to the gas heater, inspecting it briefly before looking back at Mr. Turner. "How long have you been using this to heat the house?" he asked. Mr. Turner hesitated before answering. "Few years now," he said. "Can't afford the electric heat. The bills, they're just too much these days." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening as he tried to keep his frustration in check. The system had clearly failed Mr. Turner, just as it had failed so many others. This man had given so much in his younger years, and now he was left to struggle in his old age, forgotten and alone. He turned back to Sarah, who was already making a mental list of what they could do to help. "We need to get you some proper heating," Tom said, his voice firm. "And maybe get someone out here to take a look at that window. Make sure it's secure." Mr. Turner shook his head slightly, a weary smile touching his lips. "I appreciate it, officers. I do. But I don't want to be a burden. I've been managing fine, really." Sarah knelt down beside the armchair, her eyes kind but determined. "You're not a burden, Mr. Turner. You've spent your life taking care of others, serving your country. Now it's time for us to take care of you. Just let us help, even if it's just a little." There was a long silence, and for a moment, Tom thought Mr. Turner might refuse again. But then the old man sighed, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of his pride was finally too much to bear. He nodded, his eyes closing briefly as he seemed to gather himself. "All right," he said softly. "If it's not too much trouble, maybe just a little help." Tom smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. "It's no trouble at all," he said. "We'll make some calls, see what we can do. We're not leaving you out here like this." Mr. Turner nodded again, his eyes opening to meet Tom's. There was a hint of gratitude there, mixed with a deep, aching loneliness that spoke of years spent in isolation. Max shifted at his feet, lifting his head to nuzzle against Mr. Turner's leg, as if sensing the change in his owner's demeanor. "Thank you," Mr. Turner whispered, his voice cracking slightly. "It's been a long time since anyone cared." Sarah reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "You're not alone, Mr. Turner. Not anymore. We're going to make sure you and Max are okay." As they stood, Tom took one last look around the room. The faded photographs, the dusty shelves, the flickering heater. All of it painted a picture of a man who had been left behind, forgotten by a world that had moved on without him. But not tonight. Tonight, they would make sure that Mr. Turner knew he wasn't alone, that there were still people who cared, people who would stand by him when he needed it most. "We'll be back soon," Tom said, his voice gentle as they made their way towards the door. "You hang in there, Mr. Turner. We're going to get this sorted." As they stepped out into the cold night, Sarah glanced back at the house, her heart heavy. "We have to do more than just fix a window," she said quietly, her breath visible in the frigid air. "We need to make sure he's really okay." Tom nodded, his expression grim but determined. "We will," he promised. "Whatever it takes, we're going to help him." Tom stood by the broken window, examining the jagged edges of the glass, his mind already racing with thoughts of how to help. The winter chill seeped through the broken pane, biting at his skin. As he turned, he saw Mr. Turner standing a few feet away, his posture stiff, his eyes filled with a mixture of worry and weariness. It was clear that the old man was uneasy about what might come next. "Mr. Turner, we're going to get someone to fix this window for you," Tom said, his voice filled with gentle determination. He knew the man's pride had kept him from asking for help, but it was time to step in. "We can also see about getting some better heating in here. This gas heater isn't enough to keep you warm, especially with winter setting in." Mr. Turner shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he was bracing himself. "I appreciate the offer, officer, but I've been doing all right on my own," he said. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of years spent managing by himself. "I've never been one to rely on others. My father always taught me to stand on my own 2 feet." Tom nodded, understanding the sentiment. It wasn't just pride, it was survival. The man had weathered more storms than Tom could imagine, both as a veteran and as a black man who had faced countless struggles throughout his life. There was an ingrained wariness about accepting help, an instinct to guard against what might come with it. Tom stepped closer, his voice softening. "Mr. Turner, I know you've done a lot on your own," he said, "and I respect that more than you know. But sometimes it's okay to let someone lend a hand. You've earned it. You've done your part, and now it's time for others to step in." Mr. Turner looked away, his gaze drifting towards the faded photos on the mantel, memories of a life that had once been fuller. His shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of the years pressing down on him. "You don't know what it's like, officer," he murmured, "to have everyone promise you the world when you're young, only to be forgotten once you're no longer useful." Sarah, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Mr. Turner, you haven't been forgotten," she said, her tone sincere. "We're here now, and we're not going to let you do this alone anymore. You deserve to be comfortable, to be safe. You've given so much already." Mr. Turner's eyes glistened, and he swallowed hard, his gaze finally meeting Sarah's. There was a hesitation there, a vulnerability that had not been shown before. He sighed, the sound heavy in the stillness of the room. I don't want to be a burden," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I've always prided myself on being independent. It's all I've ever known." Tom placed a reassuring hand on Mr. Turner's shoulder, feeling the frailty beneath his touch. "You're not a burden. You're someone who's done a lot for others. And now it's our turn to do something for you," he said. "Everyone needs a little help sometimes. It's part of being human. And I think Max here would agree that it's time you got some help. Right, boy?" Max, sensing his name, looked up and gave a soft bark, his tail thumping gently against the floor. Mr. Turner glanced down at his dog, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "He's always been here for me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I guess I could use a little help. For his sake." Sarah smiled, her eyes warm. "That's all we ask, Mr. Turner. Let us help make things a little easier for you and Max." She exchanged a look with Tom, who nodded in agreement. There was a sense of relief in the air, as if a barrier had finally been broken down. Mr. Turner took a deep breath, his gaze moving between Tom and Sarah. For the first time, the lines on his face seemed to soften, the tension easing from his shoulders. "All right," he said, his voice steadier now. "If you're sure it's not too much trouble, I'll take the help." Tom smiled, giving Mr. Turner's shoulder a gentle squeeze before stepping back. "It's no trouble at all," he assured him. "We'll get someone to fix that window, and we'll see about getting some proper heating in here. You're not alone, Mr. Turner." "Not anymore," Sarah added. "We'll also check in regularly. Make sure you have everything you need. You've done enough on your own. Now it's time for us to do our part." Mr. Turner nodded, his eyes misting over once more. He reached down, scratching Max behind the ears. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's been a long time since anyone really cared." Tom and Sarah exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They had seen people in need before, but this felt different. It felt personal. Tom knew they couldn't change the world, but they could change this one man's life, even if just a little. And that was enough. "We care, Mr. Turner," Tom said softly, "and we're not going anywhere." As they turned to leave, Tom looked back at the old man and his faithful dog, both framed by the dim light of the room. There was still a lot to be done, but for the first time that night, Tom felt a sense of hope, a belief that they could make things right, one step at a time. Over the next few days, Tom found himself returning to Mr. Turner's house again and again, each time bringing small comforts to help ease the old veteran's struggles. Whether it was warm blankets, food, or just company, Tom made sure that Mr. Turner knew he wasn't alone anymore. Max would greet him with a wagging tail, and Mr. Turner would offer a nod of appreciation, his eyes softening each time Tom stepped through the door. Tom watched as Mr. Turner gradually began to open up. It started with small anecdotes, stories about his days in the military, the camaraderie he shared with his fellow soldiers, the adventures they had and the hardships they faced. The pride in Mr. Turner's voice was unmistakable, but there was also a lingering pain that spoke of loss, of friendships forged in fire and lost to time. As he spoke, his eyes would often drift to the worn photographs on the mantel, the memories of those who had come and gone etched deeply into his soul. One afternoon, as the snow outside continued to fall softly, Tom sat in the small, cluttered living room while Mr. Turner shared a story about a particular mission that had nearly gone wrong. His voice was steady, but his eyes were distant, as if he could still see the faces of his comrades. "We were pinned down, and for a moment, I thought that was it," Mr. Turner said, his gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the window. "But we made it out. All of us. It's funny, the things that stick with you. The laughter, the fear, the feeling that we were all in it together." Tom listened intently, moved by the raw honesty in Mr. Turner's words. He realized that these stories were not just tales of the past. They were pieces of Mr. Turner's identity, fragments of a life filled with both triumph and hardship. It dawned on Tom just how much this man had endured, how much he had given without ever asking for anything in return. He could see how important Max was in Mr. Turner's life, The dog wasn't just a pet. He was family, a loyal companion who had been there through thick and thin. It was during these moments that Tom felt the bond between them solidify. He was no longer just a police officer doing his duty. He had become a friend, someone Mr. Turner could rely on. He found himself genuinely caring about Mr. Turner's well-being, not out of obligation but out of respect and compassion. The old veteran's resilience, his quiet strength, and his determination to maintain his independence, despite everything, touched Tom deeply. Max would often rest his head on Mr. Turner's knee as he spoke, his eyes closing, as if the sound of his owner's voice brought him comfort. Tom couldn't help but smile at the sight. The bond between Mr. Turner and Max was something pure, unbreakable. It was clear that the old man would do anything for his dog, and that devotion was reciprocated in every wag of Max's tail, every gentle nuzzle against Mr. Turner's hand. As Tom prepared to leave one evening, Mr. Turner stood by the door, his frail frame silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. "You know, officer," he said, his voice a little stronger than it had been days ago, "I never thought I'd let anyone help me like this. But you've shown me that there are still good people out there. People who care." Tom felt a lump in his throat, and he nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "You deserve it, Mr. Turner. You've done so much for others. It's time someone was there for you." Mr. Turner smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to erase some of the years etched onto his face. "I suppose Max and I are lucky then," he said, looking down at his loyal companion, who gave a soft bark as if in agreement. As Tom left that night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that there was still much to be done, repairs to the house, arrangements to be made for better heating. But he also knew that Mr. Turner no longer faced these challenges alone. The bond they had formed, forged through shared stories and quiet moments, was something that neither time nor hardship could break. And for Tom, that was more than enough. One cold evening, Tom was just settling down at home when his phone rang. The screen lit up with Mr. Turner's name, and a sense of dread settled in Tom's chest. He answered quickly, hearing the panic in Mr. Turner's voice even before he could say hello. "Officer, it's Max. He's not doing well. I don't know what to do," Mr. Turner said, his voice breaking, a vulnerability Tom hadn't heard before. Ignoring protocol and without a second thought, Tom grabbed his coat and rushed out the door. The drive to Mr. Turner's house seemed longer than usual, each turn of the wheel filled with worry. When he finally arrived, Mr. Turner was standing in the doorway, his face lined with anxiety. Max lay by his feet, his breathing shallow, his usual energy completely gone. Tom knelt beside Max, gently stroking the old dog's fur. "It's okay, Mr. Turner," he said, looking up at the frail man. "We'll get him to the vet. He's going to be all right." Mr. Turner nodded, though his eyes were filled with doubt and fear. Tom could see how much Max meant to him. This dog was more than just a pet. He was family, the one constant in Mr. Turner's life. Tom helped Mr. Turner into the car, carefully lifting Max into the back seat. The drive to the veterinary clinic was quiet, the only sound the hum of the engine and Mr. Turner's shaky breathing. Tom kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, watching the way Mr. Turner kept his hand on Max, whispering soft reassurances to his loyal companion. It was clear that this dog was his lifeline, and Tom felt a fierce determination to do whatever it took to help. At the clinic, the vet took Max in immediately. Mr. Turner hesitated in the waiting room, his hands trembling as he sat down, his eyes never leaving the door that led to the examination area. Tom sat beside him, his presence a quiet reassurance. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and when the vet finally returned, her expression was kind but serious. Max needed treatment, and it wouldn't be cheap. Mr. Turner opened his mouth, ready to argue that he couldn't afford it, but Tom spoke up before he could. "Do whatever needs to be done," Tom said firmly, pulling out his wallet. Mr. Turner looked at him, his eyes wide with a mix of gratitude and protest. "Officer, I can't let you." Tom shook his head, his gaze steady. "You can and you will. Max is family, and he deserves the best care. Let me do this, Mr. Turner. Sometimes, accepting help is as courageous as offering it. Mr. Turner's eyes filled with tears, and he looked down at his hands. His voice barely a whisper. I don't know how to thank you. No one's ever done something like this for me. Tom placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. You don't have to thank me. You've done enough, Mr. Turner. Let us be there for you now. The vet returned a little while later with good news. Max would need some care, but he was going to pull through. The relief that washed over Mr. Turner was almost palpable. He closed his eyes, a single tear escaping down his weathered cheek. Thank you, he whispered, his voice cracking. Thank you so much. Tom smiled, his own eyes misting over. He's a tough one, just like his owner, he said, his voice warm. As they drove back to Mr. Turner's house, the tension that had filled the car earlier was replaced by a sense of hope. Mr. Turner reached over, resting his hand on Tom's arm. You're a good man, Officer Richards. I'll never forget this. Tom nodded, his heart full. We're in this together, Mr. Turner. You're not alone, and you never will be. When they finally returned home, Tom helped Mr. Turner get Max settled, making sure everything was in place before he left. As he stood at the door, ready to go, Mr. Turner looked at him, his eyes filled with gratitude. You've given me more than just help tonight, officer. You've given me hope. Tom nodded, his voice soft. That's all any of us need sometimes, Mr. Turner. Just a little hope. With that, he left, the cold night air biting at his skin, but his heart warm with the knowledge that, tonight, he had made a difference. As the days passed, Tom found himself dedicating more time to helping Mr. Turner get back on his feet. He spoke with his colleagues at the precinct, sharing Mr. Turner's story, and it wasn't long before the community began to rally around the elderly veteran. Contributions came in, some offered their time, others provided materials, all with a shared goal of giving Mr. Turner the comfort and dignity he deserved. Tom arranged for the broken window to be repaired first, ensuring the winter chill stayed outside where it belonged. Soon, a local heating company stepped in, installing a new furnace to replace the aging gas heater that had long ceased to do its job properly. Each time Tom visited, he saw the gradual transformation of Mr. Turner's home. The once cold and worn-down house was slowly becoming a warm, inviting place. More than the physical changes, though, it was the people that made the biggest difference. Tom watched as neighbors Mr. Turner hadn't spoken to in years knocked on his door, bringing warm meals or just staying for a cup of tea. He saw the look of surprise in Mr. Turner's eyes when a group of local kids came by to shovel his driveway, their laughter echoing through the crisp winter air. There was something beautiful about the way the community came together, a reminder that even in the quietest corners, people cared. One sunny afternoon, Tom stood with Mr. Turner on the newly repaired porch, watching as a couple of volunteers worked on the front yard. The snow had finally begun to melt, revealing the patches of earth beneath, and the air carried the fresh promise of spring. Mr. Turner leaned heavily on his cane, his eyes glistening as he watched the activity around his home. It's been a long time since I felt like I belonged anywhere, Mr. Turner said quietly, his gaze following a young couple as they carried bags of mulch to the garden. He shook his head, a smile tugging at his lips. I never thought I'd see this place look so lively again. Tom turned to him, his voice filled with warmth. You do belong, Mr. Turner. You've always belonged. Sometimes we just need a reminder that people care, that we're not alone. He paused, watching as Max lay contentedly on the porch, his eyes half closed in the sun. And this is what community is about. Lifting each other up, especially when we need it most. Mr. Turner nodded, his eyes still shining. I suppose I had forgotten that, he said. He looked at Tom, his expression one of genuine gratitude. You've given me that reminder, officer. I don't think I can ever repay you for that. Tom smiled, shaking his head. You don't have to repay me, Mr. Turner. Seeing you here, seeing you smile, That's more than enough. Besides, you've given me something too. You've shown me what real strength looks like, what it means to keep going even when times get tough. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the neighborhood, Mr. Turner let out a deep breath, the tension that had lived in his shoulders for years seeming to melt away. He glanced around at the people who had gathered, friends, neighbors, strangers who had become something more. It was as if the walls he had built around himself, the barriers forged by years of hardship and loneliness, had finally begun to crumble. "I never thought I'd have this again," he said softly, almost to himself. "A place that feels like home. People who care." Tom rested a hand on Mr. Turner's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You're not alone anymore. We're all in this together, and we're going to make sure you're comfortable and happy. This is your home, Mr. Turner, and we're all here to make sure it stays that way." As the volunteers began to pack up for the day, waving their goodbyes and promising to return, Tom helped Mr. Turner back inside. The warmth from the new furnace filled the small living room, a stark contrast to the chill that had once seeped through every corner. Mr. Turner settled into his chair, Max curling up beside him, his head resting on Mr. Turner's feet. Tom stood by the door for a moment, taking it all in. The repaired house, the warmth, the content look on Mr. Turner's face. All of it painted a picture of hope and healing. "I'll be by tomorrow to check in," Tom said, his voice soft. "And remember, if you need anything, all you have to do is call." Mr. Turner smiled, a genuine smile that seemed to brighten the room. "Thank you, Tom, for everything." Tom nodded, his heart full as he stepped outside, the crisp evening air greeting him. As he walked to his car, he looked back at the house, now glowing warmly in the twilight. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, of community, of new beginnings. And for Mr. Turner, it was the start of a new chapter, one filled with hope, connection, and the knowledge that he was never truly alone. This story reminds us of the transformative power of compassion and community. Officer Tom's dedication and Mr. Turner's journey show that even the smallest act of kindness can reshape lives. Thank you for watching this story of resilience and hope. Please like, comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 to join us for more inspiring stories.